There is no hard and fast rule that you have to follow the text. Realization of truth is an internal thing, and texts are if your bhakti is separating you from others, creating divisions, creating hierarchies, then you're on the wrong path. It is important to work on your body because this is an instrument through which you are going to realize that supreme. So, by doing pranayam or pratyahar or dharana, dhyan, samadhi, you cannot realize that supreme truth. It is because of the dance and sattva, rajas, and tamas that the entire cosmos comes into its manifested form. There is not a single being in the cosmos that is not fearing from death. You can kill a human being, but you cannot kill a culture. Initially, I saw different divine forms as separate entities. Mahadev was separate, and Narayan was separate, and Devi was separate. I tried to understand these compartments that my brain had formed. The only one who can, get you rid of the compartments of past, present, and future is Mahadev because he's Mahakal.
When we talk about bhakti, the word instantly evokes a sense of devotion, surrender, and a deep connection with the divine. Bhakti, rooted in ancient spiritual traditions, is not just about rituals and worship. It's about cultivating a personal and heartful relationship with higher powers. It transcends all boundaries of religion and philosophy. I invited on my podcast Dr. Vandana Sharma, who is an academician, a philosopher, and a PhD graduate from the University of Delhi. We explored the essence of bhakti as a transformative journey of love, faith, and self-realization. Join me on this podcast with Dr. Vandana, where we discuss bhakti, its true meaning, and how it continues to inspire millions across the globe. Namaste, Dr. Vandana. Thank you so much for attending my podcast.
Thank you so much. Namaste, Har Har Mahadev. It is, in fact, a pleasure to be here. And this is all because of you and the grace of Mahadev.
No, thank you. It's because of you, actually. It was you who originally connected with me, and I was looking at your credentials on Instagram. And I thought to myself, yes, this is something I've been looking to talk about. The history, the Vedas, which I absolutely adore, which I believe I mentioned to you previously. So today's we're discussing bhakti in a lot of sense. So the first thing for me, I suppose, is if you could share your journey from being a academician and philosopher, how have you ended up exploring your spiritual practices and how did it all start for you?
So, well, it's a long story, but I'll cut it short. I do not consider myself as an academician or a philosopher. In fact, all of this just happened, you know. So, my bhakti towards Mahadev, it does not come from this life at all. I feel that it has come from countless lives that I've lived because I do believe in the concept of karya karan siddhant, or what you call cause and effect. So if I take that into account, we cannot say that this bliss of bhakti has been bestowed upon me in this life. So I'm carrying it since many lives, and I've always, carried this unexplainable, profound love for Mahadev that feels very ancient and very deep and very deeply rooted in my soul. So, when I was young, I lost my father, and then my grandfather brought me up. I lost my grandparents also, and I went through this very dark period. Um, when I stopped having any faith in the Supreme. The pain that I was going through, It made me question everything that I saw and everything that people believed. And despite of that, I was just not able to let go of Mahadev somehow. Despite the pain, I was just not able to be angry with him. And then one day, I was blessed with a small little child, not a human child, but four-legged canine. I believe he was my guru. And he came into my life. The 14 and a half years that I spent with him were the most beautiful, most spiritual years of my life. But one day he eventually left me and he went away. So I'm sorry, I just have some tears in my eyes, right now. So these experiences of love and loss um, transformed my understanding of existence and divinity. I'm really sorry for this.
No, no, take your time.
Yeah, so the loss that I went through, and the love that I got, it transformed my entire understanding of the divine, our relationship with him, and the entire cosmos. So initially I saw different divine forms as separate entities. Mahadev was separate and Narayan was separate, and Devi was separate. I tried to understand these compartments that my brain had formed, through the Cartesian dualism. Just as you understand a machine, I was trying to understand these parts. But finally, I realized that it is the brain that deceives you to break down reality into parts. And that was the time when my journey finally, led me to Advaita. And when I started understanding Advaita, I realized that reality exists beyond the poles of opposite. And I began to understand that, what I was seeking couldn't be confined to the dualistic modes of understanding everything like a machine in parts. The separation that I was trying to understand actually were because of my avidya or my ignorance. Because truth has no parts; it is complete, it is whole, it is beyond any polarities, it is beyond any dualism. And now, at the moment in my life, I just have pure devotion towards Mahadev. All that I've gone through, the loss, the questioning, the suffering, the understanding, has guided me to handhold him and walk without trying to understand him. Because we, with our limited senses, we, with our limited brain, cannot understand that supreme who's beyond forms and beyond names. And so the only thing we can do is, like Arjun, just fold our hands and just bow down and submit ourselves.
Now, you've obviously studied the Atharva Veda, and you've also done a lot of philosophical, well, I'd say papers on a number of these through your research. How did your research on Atharva Veda influence your understanding of bhakti?
Right. So, well, when we get into a research, um, we have to carry out the research based on our logic and understanding and the references that we derive out of it. But having said that, when I question how did I reach here, what is the meaning of being here, was I the chosen one, why just me, how did I get this opportunity? So when I delve on all these questions, the only answer I get is the supreme. So when I look back at the sequence of events that brought me to this research at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, which is under Honorable Draupadi Murmuji, um, the opportunity that opened up for me, the text that I've come across, the mentors who guided me, I can do nothing but accept that there is a divine hand of Supreme. Now, what began for me as a scholarly exploration when I started off has transformed into a profound spiritual experience. Now, whenever I read the Atharva Veda, each verse that I study, every ritual that I try to analyze, every mantra that I try to translate, seems like it is deepening my submission to Mahadev. So rather than just expanding my academic knowledge, um, I have started questioning uh, if the research is merely academic, or is it going to take me, or am I going to realize a higher purpose out of it? So these are the questions that keep coming in my heart and mind. And Atharva Veda itself, I personally feel, so when you read a text with submission, it speaks to you. And I've observed that even when I was doing my PhD. So now Atharva Veda, is revealing layers beyond its scholarly facets, and it speaks to me. I mean, I'm not getting the best of words to explain you, but the verses that I read, they just make me submit to the supreme. Now here I have a paradox, a beautiful paradoxical journey. So the more I approach the text with academic rigor, you know the more they lead me to spiritual surrender. So my analytical mind becomes a pathway to bhakti, is what I can say.
Now, for our audience who are abroad, what would your definition of bhakti be?
So this is a tough question. So definition of bhakti is surrender. You just surrender. For you cannot understand that truth which is beyond understanding. You cannot understand that supreme which is beyond forms. You cannot understand that whole which is beyond names. The only thing that you can do, even if you try to understand that supreme from textbooks, you will just get an iota of what it could be. I'm not even referring it as him, because it is not him, it is not her. It is beyond all the genders. And if you try to understand that supreme from an idol, then also you will get an iota of it. And when you mix all these truths, even all these truths together cannot explain what that supreme is. So the supreme is not a subject of logical mind. The supreme is not a subject of reason. The supreme is a subject of anubhuti or experience. And everybody has their own experience. And when everybody have their own experience of realizing that truth, there is difference and similarity. Difference because we all have a different journey, and so we realize the truth on our own terms, uh, the ways we see it, based on our prarabdha and where we stand in the process of our journey. And similar because whosoever has realized that truth has become similar in their behavior. For example, when Nikola Tesla realized it, when Pythagoras realized it, when Albert Einstein realized it, when Buddha realized it, when Shankaracharya realized it, Mahavir realized it, they had some similarity. They became compassionate towards other beings. They became calm. There was a component of ahimsa. They were rooted in ahimsa. They were rooted in sarva bhuta hit, doing or meaning well for all beings, irrespective of their names, forms, caste, and religion. So I think that is the definition of bhakti. You cannot define it, but you can understand it. You can't define it. So if you define it, you have closed the doors of bhakti. I don't want to do that. Because bhakti is not just bhakti towards a certain deity. Bhakti also means the way you perform your daily duties. Bhakti also means your surrender to your music. Bhakti also means surrender to your work. So you cannot give one definition of bhakti.
I actually love what you just said there. Now, before I delve into anything else, you've mentioned Albert Einstein, you mentioned Tesla. Is it true that they too had this wonderful understanding of what Hinduism was, particularly the texts as well?
Yeah, so I have been extremely influenced, and I have read Einstein a lot. So I'll give you an example of Einstein. So Einstein never believed in the Abrahamic God who stays in some heaven. Uh, Einstein was Einstein believed in the God of Spinoza, which manifests in every creation. And later on, he was also influenced by Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was somebody who had read the Upanishads, and in fact, he said that the in the coming times, Upanishads is going to be the religion of the masses. So, at the end of it, Einstein also ended up reading the Bhagavad Gita, and then he had a lot of conversations with Rabindranath Tagore, Indira Gandhi, and Jawaharlal Nehru. And later on, Albert Einstein came down to this thought process that, being a vegetarian is the best way of being. And therefore, he gave up non vegetarianism. And he said that whatever is in me is also there in all the beings. Maybe the names and forms can be different. So I can explain this to you, how Shankaracharya explains this. And I'm sure this thought had traveled to Albert Einstein because he had read the Bhagavad Gita, and Bhagavad Gita is Pancham Veda. So, we saw similarity of behavior in Albert Einstein and also Pythagoras, who ended up, reading the Bharatiya Darshan. He also studied, the Pythagoras theorem he took from India. And he was highly influenced by the theory of karma and punarjan, so on and so forth. And therefore, he was someone who propagated vegetarianism. I'm talking about Pythagoras right now. So, when you realize that truth, you walk away from differences, you walk away from mine and yours, you walk away from animal, bird, and human beings. They are different forms but made out of the pancha mahabhuta, and they are the one who are conscious, so they have an element of shivatva.
Yeah, you sent me some wonderful photographs, which I'll share with the audience, of all these animals that you're holding, and just the oneness that you have with them and the connection that you have. Now, going back to bhakti, what do you believe are the different stages of bhakti according to all these traditional texts that we read?
So there are various texts, each pointing towards that supreme reality. Unfortunately, just like I show you, hey, look, we have the moon there. You miss out on the moon and you just keep looking at my finger. So all the what we do is we get entangled with the text, and we stop looking at the supreme reality. The texts are pointers, they are not the supreme reality. They are the path through which we can realize that supreme reality. But if in certain case the texts are not working out for you, I mean, there is no hard and fast rule that you have to follow the text. Because there are times if you're just following the text, then you're only following the text and your entire concentration is on the text. So, honestly speaking, I do not think to realize that supreme reality, you need to follow any text. Texts will help you in leading a beautiful life. They'll make life easier for you. You'll be able to deal with pain and pleasure in a more balanced way, you know but as far as realizing the truth is concerned, can the text help you realize the truth? Not really. I don't think so. Because you know realization of truth is an internal thing, and texts are material in nature. So through material you cannot realize that which is immaterial. I always give this example to my students. From a dog comes out a dog, from a cat comes out a cat, from material comes out material, and from immaterial comes out immaterial. So if you want to realize that supreme, you will have to go beyond the material, is what I think. So I do not, in my journey of life, or for that matter, there are a lot of people who were not well read. They were merely poets. And we had people like Mirabai. They didn't follow any text. They just followed their heart. And I think if your bhakti is separating you from others, if your bhakti is creating divisions, if your bhakti is creating hierarchies, then you're on the wrong path. You need to discard the text right away.
So then, how do people reach that point of reality? What sort of, I wouldn't say things. I'm supposing, meditation could be one way to reach that point of reality. But I've also seen that you do yoga. And interestingly, I should add that my 5-year-old son from nowhere, he does a lot of yoga. And I don't know where he gets it from. So it's very interesting.
So, beautiful question. So, firstly, if we go to the roots of yoga, Maharishi Patanjali did not introduce any asanas. Only Sukhasan is there. But he had Yam, Niyam, Asan, Pranayam. And Asan does not mean Asan as in 64 Yoga. So Yam, Niyam, Asan, Pranayam, Pratyahar, Dharana, Dhyan, and Samadhi. But when we come to Gorakhnath tradition, we find that, they say that no, before you realize that supreme, it is important to work on your body, because this is an instrument through which you are going to realize that supreme. Now, if we go to Aproksha Anubhuti of Adi Shankaracharya, where he talks about the 15 folds of Advaita Yoga, he says, how can instrument be a part of realization? Realization is that point where instruments lose their meaning. So by doing pranayam or pratyahar or dharana, dhyan, samadhi, you cannot realize that supreme truth. It is a completely internal exercise. It is not external in nature. So yes, you can get good health from yoga. Yes, it can help you in concentration. Yes, it can help you in meditation. It can help you lowering down your bp. I mean, obviously lowering down your bp is not the aim in yoga. The aim is nirvikalpa samadhi. But again, the point is that which is beyond material, how can you realize it through material, is my question. And that is what in Aproksha Anubhuti Adi Shankar also asks. That which is beyond material, how can you realize it through material? And that which is material, how can you put it right through non-material? If somebody is on an operation table, you need material to operate him. Not by visualizing can you operate him, right? So material can be realized by material. So material eyes can realize material things. And when we have to realize the non-material, we have to close our eyes, because we need to look within. And that is where eyes have no work to do at all. So again, my answer is that, yoga and meditation and all these things can be techniques of having a better life. But you tell me, all these people who are, doing a lot of asanas, being good in your asana does not prove that you are a realized being. So no matter how good asanas I can perform, maybe I can roll my body and, I can stand upside down, it in no way proves that I have realized that supreme. All those people who are, posting their Instagram reels on asan and, doing all kinds of difficult asan, just because I've seen that, look into their lives. They are frustrated. They have no money. They are looking for marketing online. They are doing all sorts of things. These are not the characteristics of a realized being. Not characteristics of realized beings. So the characteristics of realized beings are mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita. So you have 26 characteristics of a realized being, and that includes, he is the one who says Satya. He's the one who is who doesn't differentiate between a man or man and animal. He's ahimsa priya. He has compassion for all beings. He's shanti priya. He wants no praise, and he's not affected by any kind of ill words that are thrown towards him. So, again, as I say, all these are instruments of leading a better life. They may help you in realizing the supreme truth, but at the end of it, they cannot be the instrument to realize the supreme truth.
So interesting.
So,
Yeah, how I'm going back to bhakti, and whilst you bring up all the answers and everything to this, I'm beginning to ask deeper questions, or questions, because I have an inclination towards understanding how you get that realization. But going back to bhakti, how logical is it, and is it reason based?
okay, so I'm going to answer your question from two point of views. First thing, the first answer is based on my experience, and the second answer is to those who say that no, without logic there is no bhakti, without logic there is nothing. So I'll give an answer to them as well. So first, coming to my understanding of bhakti and logic. Since I said that bhakti is not an instrument, oh sorry, bhakti is not a subject of mind and reason. Therefore, you cannot realize bhakti through logic and reason, because logic and reason is for material things. And now, when I give you the second point of view, you will understand my first point of view in a better manner. So, bhakti assumes that all humans and all sentient beings are not mechanical in nature. You see, they are not a machine that you can understand through logic and reason. Or, so the cell is not here, I need to put the cell, and now, the clock will start working. This is not how sentient beings or humans are made. They are thinking beings, they are living beings, they are feeling beings, they have pains, they have pleasures, they have ailments, right? Now, coming to the second part, bhakti is based on cause and effect, just like science. So, when a bhakt starts walking on the path of bhakti, he goes through various texts. Now, these texts document what happens when you walk on the path of bhakti. And when a bhakt is walking on the path of bhakti, he gets predictable results out of it. Now, these predictable results and whatever he gets out of these predictable results can be measured like science. For example, let's say a bhakt, starts doing bhajan every evening, or he starts doing nam jap every evening. And if you want to measure the materialistic part of it, because logic can only understand the materialistic part of it good enough. You can check his medical records, you'll see there's a drop in his blood pressure, you'll see there's a drop in his stress levels, hypertension has gone away, sugar levels have come down. So it is measurable. And this is not something that I am saying. This is a research which has happened in RML Hospital and the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies. So, if you want to check all the material parameters, well, bhakti will help you in measuring that as well. Just as you want to check the effects of paracetamol, or before taking paracetamol, the fever was 102, and after taking it, it came back to 97. So, same with bhakti also. The materialistic part you can measure. But what bhakti says is that in order to get a comprehensive picture of bhakti and truth, reason and logic cannot be the only instruments. They can be one of the instruments, but they cannot be or they could not be just the instrument through which you can measure bhakti, and that where your heart and your bhav is involved. You need much more than logic and reason. Just as you cannot understand a human being or a dog merely by instruments, you need bhav, you need emotions, because they are living and thinking beings. Similarly, you cannot put logic only to understand bhakti. And therefore, I come back to my first argument, that bhakti cannot be understood by logic and reason. Only things of material nature, only things that can be brought down to numbers, can be understood through logic and reason. And bhakti is beyond numbers, and bhakti is beyond material.
Now, this is a very interesting question. You see a person cries, they sing, and they dance when it comes to, or in bhakti. Now, some talk to trees, which I do. I talk to my plants quite a bit. I can talk to animals. Like, you speak to them, you give them that love, and they understand it. You also speak to nature, mountains. But the general public may refer to it as being crazy. How do you respond to this?
Yes, absolutely. And I always tell this to my students that all those names who have done something different or who have been called genius later on have been termed as crazy by the normal public always. Whether it was Mirza Ghalib, he was not respected when he was living. It was only after he died that his poetry was celebrated. Albert Einstein was considered crazy. Right, but we all knew what a genius he was. So, whenever you're a genius, you will be called crazy by the general public. And the same goes in bhakti as well. So, bhakti may seem to be extremely crazy for those who have not experienced it, but for those who have experienced it, it is a very normal thing to cry. Where words when you're not able to communicate something in words or tell somebody, like I'm not able to tell you how I feel for Mahadev, uh, to a certain point I'll try my best to use the words that can best describe my feeling, but there'll be a point when I'll feel helpless, and that is the point where my tears will flow down. And those tears are nothing but they are lines that my words could not write, but my tears are writing down. So on the paper of my cheeks they are writing down those lines or those kavita. So the highest form of bhakti in terms of words or expressions, I feel, can be your poetry, can be your dramatics, can be your artistic expression. That is the highest form of bhakti in terms of material expression. But there comes a time when these are also not able to do justice to your bhakti, and that is why if you see the Indian tradition here, when you have attained the highest level in your music, you forego your music, you take sannyas from your music, because now there's nothing more to sing. What will you sing? All the permutation and combination of the Saat Swar has been sung by you, and that you saw in terms of Lata Mangeshkar also. She took sannyas from music. So if you see it from a different angle, everything comes from silence, and everything goes back into silence. Silence is the highest music for a musician.
How does bhakti bridge the gap then between the formless and the form based worship?
Yes, that's a very good question. So, see, bhakti is not, it's not single dimensional. It is not just what I'm saying. In bhakti, also, you have various levels. So, for example, uh, you have initially, so this is a pedagogy also in Indian system of understanding the reality. You start by worshipping an idol. Now that idol is not just an idol. There are a lot of ways of looking at it. Firstly, that idol is a encoding done by our rishis. So maybe our rishis were aware that someday, something like invasion can happen in India. So the highest wisdom should be spread amongst the general public in the form of folk dance, folklores, folk music, so on and so forth. So that even if you burn the text, even if you tear away the text, the wise ones can go between the public and take out those symbols and decode them again. So these are not just idols, but they are tantra and yantra in three dimension form, right? And so for a normal person it looks like an idol, but for a scientist it may have a deeper meaning, for a sannyasi it may have a deeper meaning. Initially a child is supposed to concentrate on a certain form, let's say Mahadeva. Now Mahadeva has a huge philosophy, that idol has a huge philosophy. Initially the child may not understand, but as he grows, he will understand why is he blue. Well, he's blue because the last color that our eye can see is blue. So the sky has no color of its own, right? But you can see blue because scientifically the last color that your eye can see is blue. And therefore, when you see Krishna or you see Ram or you see Shiva, they are depicted as blue. And a lot of people would say, oh no, because he had halahal. No, that is not the reason. The reason is because it has a great science within. Then again, he sees that Mahadev is holding a trishul. So inquisitive child will go to his mother, run to his mother, that does Mahadev, kill all animals? Should I also kill animals? And then mother will tell him, no. Those three tridents, what are they? They depict past, present, and future. The only one who can, get you rid of the compartments of past, present, and future is Mahadev, because he's Mahakal. And then she will say that it is not just this. The three types of sufferings that you have in this cosmos, Adi Daivik, Adi Bhautik, and Adhyatmik, they are represented in the form of that trident. And then he will ask, okay, mother, but what is this trident then? Sorry, what is this tripunda then? So she will say, we have sattva, we have rajas, and we have tamas. And it is because of the dance and sattva, rajas, and tamas that the entire cosmos comes into its manifested form. But who is Mahadev? He is Trigunatmak. He is the one in whom all these three guns, they lose their potency. And then he will ask, mother, but what is the meaning of this third eye? Oh, this third eye, let me tell you a story about it. So these two eyes can only see material things. But this eye has the potency of not just seeing everything through the eyes of wisdom, which means everything that you see in the cosmos is momentary. And even while it is momentary, it is changing its form. So, as I speak to Shruti doctor, the moment I got connected to her, from that time till this time, she has changed. So the dance of Shiva has changed her completely from that time till this time. There are many atoms in her body which have died, and there are many atoms which have been produced. So, so mother will tell all of this, and so then he will realize, oh, I was not just worshipping an idol, I was worshipping an entire philosophy. And now, when he goes back to the idol, the way he sees it will completely change his outlook towards the entire cosmos, because now that idol has the entire cosmic beings in it, and the entire cosmic beings that you have in the cosmos have that idol in it, or that concept in it. So, from the form to the formless, this is a pedagogy. And I would also like to tell you that, in the Upanishads and the Vedanta Shastra, there are a lot of examples which have been given, that just as water has no particular form of its own, but whichever vessel you will put water in, you put it in a glass or in a let's say a bottle, or in a tumbler, it will take the shape of that vessel. However, it itself has no form. Similarly, that supreme exists in every entity. It becomes that every entity, it envelopes that every entity. He has no form. So the Vedas say, Te Pratima Na Asti. It has no form, it has no idol, but every idol has that supreme in it, and therefore all the idols that you see in the cosmos are nothing but his manifestations.
Now, I have a very interesting question. When we were little, when we used to go to the temples to pray, and there is, sometimes you go there and you do puja to Parvati Mata, and they would say, "Don't take any leather, don't take any leather." And this question actually my brother posed when he was very young. He turned around and said, "Yeah, but Shiv Bhagwan wears the tiger skin. So why is that?" And they are together. And to this, the interesting thing is my mom went, "You know what, that is such a good question." And from that day to this day, I've hung on to that question. So perhaps you may be able to answer this. We say don't wear leather, but yet Shiva himself used to wear the skin. Why?
That's a beautiful question. So before I tell you about this, let me also mention Shivamanas Puja here. It's a text written by Shankaracharya. So ideally, what is preached is that even you don't even need flowers to worship. Why? Because why should you interfere in the dharma of a flower? The flower has equal right to, become a flower from a bud, then dry out and fall down. But what you do is you pluck it and you put it on the deity. Have you ever asked the flower, do you want to, die, and do you want to be, a piece of decoration on a certain deity? I think by Anuman or inference, I would say that no, he will refuse to do so. The flower will say, no, I don't want to be a piece of decoration on any deity, Shiva, Narayan, or XYZ. I don't want that. So when that kind of a thing is preached by Adi Shankar, we need to question ourselves. Does the tiger chal that Shiva wears, is it because he has killed some tiger? No. The tiger chal only is a symbolism of your greatest fear. And tiger represents the fear of death. And what does Shiva do? Shiva, because he is Adi Yogi, because of the science of yoga and meditation, he he tells his disciples to win over the fear of death and sit upon it as if though it is his what you call mat where he sits down. So what he does is, because of his meditative qualities, he eradicates the fear of death. And that death, which is a part of every being, there is not a single being in the cosmos that is not fearing from death. And this is what Shiv in the Adi Yogi form teaches you, to have control on the fear of death. So that is a symbolism. Just as trident is a symbolism, he's not actually carrying a trident. Ganga is a symbolism. So what does Ganga do? Ganga, wherever it touches the ground, it fertilizes it. It is beneficial for all beings, whether it is a fish or a human being. It doesn't discriminate between any beings. And therefore, similarly, when you see Ganga, appearing from the jatas of Shiva, what does it mean? It only means that the Ganga of Gyan, the knowledge, the Ganga of wisdom, your Ganga of wisdom should be such that wherever you go, no matter which land, which place, to which being, you should always, fertilize them. You should always encourage them with the wisdom of Ganga that you hold in your head.
Now, if you previously mentioned that Shiv or Shiva is formless. Now, if you yourself know that Shiva is formless, then why do you keep posting photos or pictures of Mahadev on Instagram? And why is your bhakti for that form?
Okay. So first thing first, yes, there's no doubt that he is formless. But what if you come to know that your dad is the Prime Minister of America? Will that change your relationship with him in your house? I think you'll still pull his hair and his cheeks, and you'll give him a peck and all of that. So despite knowing that he's formless, my relationship with him, at a material level, will not change. For me, he's still that father figure, that mother figure, my best friend, the one who I look up to. And that will not change despite knowing that he's the formless, and all forms are nothing but his forms. Yet, that particular form in which I see him as my father will not change my relationship with him. So that is the only reason. But now, when I see that form, I see it with a lot of wisdom. So when I'm posting a picture of Mahadev on Instagram with a Trishul, I know he is the one who can, break me free from the clutches of Teen Akal, or three forms of time. And when I look at his third eye, I I just like a child wants to be like his father, I also want to be like my father and develop that third eye, because I want to see this entire cosmos with the eyes of wisdom.
So you mentioned three times.
Three
Can
times.
you?
Times, three types of times. That's past, present, and
And
future.
future.
Yes. Bhutakal,
Understood.
Vartaman. Yes.
Understood. Understood.
So I am living this reality as well of, and this I am doing out of Anand. It is not going to make any difference to that Supreme, but it is for my Anand. This Leela is for my Anand. Realizing that the Supreme has no form, no name, no upadhis does not mean that I make my life boring and dull. So my life still needs to be decorated with aesthetics, with music, with drama, with poetry, with love. And therefore, seeing him in that form, and also seeing him as the dog outside, as the cat outside, as the bird who flies, as my mother, as all things in the cosmos that can exist, as all things that cannot ever exist, as all things that have died and have become a part of him, that things which will never ever be produced by time, they all exist as the Supreme Mahadev for me.
So we see Shiva as depicted in pictures, so many photographs of what he looks like. So tell me, is that truly how he is? What do the texts say about supreme reality then?
Yeah, so as I initially mentioned, that when you look at a picture, it the Vedas say te pratima na asti. There is no picture of him, no pratima, no idol of him. But then again, the Vedas also say eko aham bahusyam. I'm one and I shall become many. And then the Ishavasya Upanishad, will say that. Ishavasyam idam sarvam means that Supreme is everywhere. There is not a speck in the cosmos where it does not exist. So you can see contradicting thoughts here. So contradicting thoughts. So now it is important to understand, because everything, and I've already answered this, so that Supreme has no form of its own, but when it manifests, it becomes all the forms. And therefore, all the idols that you see, and when I say idols, I mean myself, I mean you, I mean the dog outside, I mean the tree, I mean the earth, I mean the galaxies, I mean the stars. All these idols are nothing but indwelled by him, enveloped by him, and manifestation of him. So when I say everything in the cosmos is he and nothing but him, that means the picture which has been drawn by the artist is also his picture. And no matter in which form he makes that picture, he may make that picture as Krishna, as Ram, as Vishnu, as Devi, as Buddha, but they are all his forms.
Now, why did our sages give the Rupa to Shiv?
Right. So, as I think I've mentioned this earlier also, that our sages wanted to encode supreme metaphysical truths, right? And they were aware, or they had shastras like Jyotish Shastra, which could, maybe they could predict that there would be a time when there would be invasion on India, because India was known as Sone ki Chidiya. We had everything, and therefore maybe they wanted to encode through tantra, mantra, and yantra a 3D form that could not be decoded by a normal person. But when a wise person saw it, he could decode the mysteries or the metaphysical truths from that particular form. So, and also one reason was culture. So they knew that these texts are going to be available only for a very few people who knew a certain language, or who knew how to go through them. What about the rest? So it was important that that supreme consciousness in all the names and forms that they could understood should become a part of the culture, because it is very difficult to kill a culture. You can kill a human being, but you cannot kill a culture. And therefore, when Shiv becomes the Atma of Bharatvarsh, or when Krishna becomes the Atma of Bharatvarsh, You can do whatever you want, you cannot kill them. You cannot kill those concepts. You can maybe transform them, but again, they'll come back with the truth.
Since we're talking about concepts, then what is the concept of Shiv Parvati? Are they genuinely married, or does this have a deeper symbolism?
Yeah, so Shiv and Parvati are often seen as, husband and wife. Now, it is very important for us to understand that Parvati symbolizes the material cause. Material cause means, this table is made of wood, so the material cause is wood. Similarly, she's Gatishil, she has motion in her, because if Prakriti, or I cannot call it nature, environment will be very bad translation of Prakriti. So if Prakriti does not have friction in her, does not have movement in her, then creation will not be possible. And then she has Trigunatmak, she has Rajas, Tamas, and Sattva in her, and therefore Parvati becomes the material cause of the entire cosmos. On the other hand, Shiv is completely opposite to Parvati. He is pure consciousness, which means he is not a material cause. He is sthir, which means he has no movement in him. Parvati is Trigunatmak. He is gun rahit. He has no gun in him. And so a coming together of consciousness and material creates the entire cosmos. So this is one thing we need to understand. And second thing that we need to understand is the Sanskrit meaning of the word pati. So pati is often understood as husband. Pati is not husband. So I always tell this to my students in my class. So when we say Rashtrapati, it does not mean that the person sitting on Rashtrapati's chair is the husband of the entire nation. Not a right translation. Or when we say Pashupati, it does not mean he is the husband of all the animals. Or when we say Senapati, it does not mean he is the husband of all the soldiers there. No, that is a wrong understanding of Pati. Pati means controller. So here Shiv becomes, or consciousness becomes, the controller of Prakriti, the material cause. And he's not just a controller from outside, because when you have material, you have outside and inside also. These divisions come up wherever there is material. So if I have this mouse, there is an outside and there is an inside also. Why? Because this mouse is a material thing. And whatever is material has outer part and inner part. And therefore, when Shiva, controls Prakriti from inside, he is known as Antaryami. The one who controls nature from within. And that is why a seed exactly knows that I have to sprout. Who is sitting inside that seed, who knows that this seed has to sprout? How does the seed know that I have to sprout? How does a small little puppy whose eyes are closed know where am I supposed to suckle? Where am I supposed to suckle on my mother's breast? He Who tells him? So it is Antaryami, that potent energy, who is sitting in every creature, and every creature is nothing but Prakriti. So my body is Prakriti, my body is Parvati, and that which functions from within is Antaryami Shiva, and that which functions from outside is also Shiva, and therefore Prakriti is Shivadhin. It is controlled by Shiva. So marriage here does not mean marriage in terms of seven pheras they had. No, marriage is supposed to be understood like, for example, Shruti doctor says, I'm married to my work. Now work is not a male who she is married to. It only means that I have complete surrender and dedication towards my work. So when I say I'm married to my bhakti is not a male who I'm married to. Bhakti is the path where I have surrendered myself. And similarly, Parvati surrenders herself to Shiva, because Shiva is supreme consciousness. And since he is he is Gunatit, so Trigunatmak Prakriti surrenders to Gunatit, because it is there where she will get her relief.
What does the Shiva Lingam depict?
Right. Beautiful question. So there are a lot of controversies around the Shivalingam. Some say that it is a male genital sexual organ, but that is not the right understanding of it. So when you look at texts like Nyaya, Vaisesika, and Sankhya, so this word lingam is used with the connotation of mark or sign of a certain thing. For example, the sign of a doctor is Red Cross. So whenever you look at Red Cross, you know that there is a doctor, there is medical facility here. So that sign is not the doctor, but it is the sign of that doctor. Similarly, when you see the signatures of Modi ji, the signatures are not Modi ji, they are only a mark of Modi ji, right? Likewise, when you see a Gurdwara's symbol, you know that the Gurdwara is there, but that is not a Gurdwara. That is only a symbol of Gurdwara, which is depicting that yes, you can come here to aid because we have a Gurdwara here. Likewise, the Shivaling is not Shiva himself, it is the mark of that supreme reality, number one. So, this needs to be understood that Lingam is not genital organ. When we say Shivalingam, it means mark of that supreme. Number one. Now, Shivalingam is divided into three parts. So, we only have a understanding of the upper part, which is known as Shiva Peetham. And then you have the Vishnu Peetham, and then in the lowest part, you have the Brahma Peetham, which means when you're worshipping the Shivaling, you're worshipping creation, preservation, and destruction together, because these three things are not separate in the cosmos. The dance of creation, preservation, and destruction is continuing in the entire cosmos simultaneously. Likewise, when Swami Vivekanand went to the Congress of Religions, he also, said he in fact brought to light that Shivaling is nothing but an atomic structure. And yes, that is absolutely correct, because Shivling depicts two structures. First, Shivling solidifies and gives a structure to the burning jyoti within you. So if you imagine a, a diya or a deepak, and if you solidify the jyoti, it will become something like Shivling, right? So Shivling depicts the Atma Jyoti that you have, and Atma Jyoti is nothing but the light of wisdom that you have within, and that is what you worship outside in a static form. So from static to that which is inside is the journey. So that is one understanding of it. Then there are other scholars who have said that this is a solidified or a magnified form of an atom. Because if you know that Nyaya and Vaisesik were atomistic schools of Indian philosophy, and atom is supposed to be circular in motion, having three parts. Therefore, if you magnify any particular atom in your body, it is going to look like a Shivlingam. And then the three lines or the tripund on the Shivlingam depict not just Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh, but they also depict electron, proton, and neutron, and the red dot depicts Shakti, which is nucleus, the hottest part of an atom. And the inner circular part depicts the path that an atom takes to move in circular motion. And then when you go and visit a temple, you'll see Shivling. You can never have a full, you cannot go around it completely, only half. So that also depicts that, no matter how much you know this cosmos, you will never know this cosmos completely. So that is understanding of the incomplete circle. And then Shivling is the part which is visible to you. The greater part which is not visible to you is beyond the earth, and therefore it depicts that whatever you see of the cosmos, there is much more to be seen, to be known. So that is the entire philosophy of Shivlinga.
That is so interesting because, I've heard so many people say that, you may try and investigate the universe, you may try and investigate different things that are happening up there, but you really are going to open another 100,000 questions. you never you're never going to understand it in full. That is why till today science, I suppose, uh, and probably they're probably going the wrong way, but it's not for me to say, but that is why science hasn't actually understood how the universe or the world was created, because they never probably will. You can't go around the whole.
You can't. And there's another interesting thing which just came to my mind, that you see, you've seen two kinds of shivlings. One is made in a very, it's tall like a pillar, and then so that gives you an impression of being a male sex organ. But if you see the original shivlings like Mahakaleshwar and Omkareshwar and Kashi Vishwanath and the original shivlings, they are much short, they're shorter, they are like a seed. It's very round, small and round. They are not tall, no. So that also brings us to the point that everything in the cosmos starts from a small seed or a circle. So when you were in your mother's womb, you were a small little seed. The seed is also a small round shape. When you make a chapati, you have to make a round ball. All the stars and all the planets are round. Everything is going in round circular motion. The earth is also round. There is a round circle of life, of birth, life, and death. So everything is in a circular motion, and that depiction of the original natural shivlings is a symbolism of that circular movement in which the entire cosmos is going about.
Now, I know this story, but I have this one question. Now, there are, I believe, 12 Shivlings?
12 Jyotirling, yes.
Yeah, the Bara Jyotirling. Can you tell the audience, and they probably know this, but I still want to put it out there. Why are they 12? What is the story behind it? Like I said, I know the story, but I'm interested in also understanding it from you, given that you've studied all this.
Okay. So 12 boils down to 3. And ultimately, 3 is a very important number which is connected to Shiva. So you have 3 spokes in the Trishula, you have Tripunda, you have 3 eyes, right? So it boils down to 3. But apart from that, if you see the Jyotirling, at that time there were no Google Maps, and there were no satellites, nothing. But isn't it amazing that right from Kedarnath down till Rameshwaram, it is in a straight line, straight line. So that also says a lot about the mechanics, and that also says a lot about the designing techniques that we had, the science that we had. It was marvelous and fantastic. A lot of things are 3. Life itself is it's boxed up into 3: your birth, your life, your preservation, and your death. So that also boils down to 3.
So I'm going to thank you now, because there was so much I wanted to learn from you, and I'm so glad we have connected.
Thank you so much. So kind of you. Har Har Mahadev.
Har Har Mahadev.